friends, my name is Justine, I'm the Mermaid Seamstress, and today we're going to be talking about the difference between the Mertailor's Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. So a couple of years and many dollars later, I have finally completed my collection of the Fantasea Fins by Mertailor. I now have all three of them. So I started with the 2, then I loved that so much that I got the 3 when it finally came out. And then recently at Mermagicon, I decided to get the original Fantasea Fin. And I am in love with all of them for very different reasons. If you want to find specific reviews of each one, I will have a playlist linked down in the description below and probably somewhere up in the iCards. But today I want to answer all of your questions about what's the difference between all of these 3 Fantasea Fins when compared to each other. And bonus, I will do some comparing also to the Finis Luna, which is another very popular mermaid monofin that is full silicone. First things first, let's go over all of the schematic details that are listed on the Mertailor site. The Fantasea Fin 1 is the smallest of these 3 fins. It measures approximately 26 inches long by 27 inches wide and weighs about 7 to 8 pounds. The price of the Fantasea 1 at this current time is approximately $150, making it also the cheapest of these 3 monofins. The Fantasea Fin original also only comes in one solid color, which is different than the color mixing or marble kind of coloring of the Fantasy 2 and the Fantasy 3. The Fantasea Fin 2 was the next released fin of the Fantasy series, and it has a much different shape than the original Fantasea Fin. The Fantasea Fin 2 is approximately 30 inches long and 32 inches wide from tip to tip. It costs $235 and weighs between 15 to 16 pounds. The Fantasy 3 is the most recent Fantasea Fin in the Fantasea Fin series by Mertailor, and it is the largest of the 3 fins. It measures 36 inches long and 32 inches wide, which is the same size of fluke as many full silicone tails, including the Finfolk and Mertailor Spellbound tails. The Fantasy 3 is $260 US, and all of these fins are hand poured and usually made to order, meaning they don't usually build up in stock very much. And because of that, these tails can take 4 to 10 weeks to ship out, if not longer, during periods of high demand. So now that we've gone through the nitty-gritty details, I want to share with you some of my observations and then go over to some of the questions I got from my viewers over on Instagram, and then go over to the questions that I got from some of you guys over on Instagram. All 3 fins are amazing, and the Fantasea Fins are some of my absolute favorites. Is that all 3 of them, being silicone fins, swim quite differently from a lot of my other fins that are made of hard plastic, fiberglass, or even differently than the Luna monofin. All 3 of these fins have a sort of rippling motion that goes more sideways rather than just going up and down. So when you're swimming in a normal fin, you'll get a very consistent kind of rolling motion, and that's the same thing with even the Finis Luna monofin. However, with the Fantasea Fins, you kind of get this, you get that rolling motion, but you also get kind of an in and out motion. And this has to do with the fact that all 3 of the Fantasea Fins are pretty wide fins. Now, while they are all firmer towards the foot pockets than they are at the ends, because they're so wide, you get this folding motion where it kind of folds in on itself a little bit more than I observe other fins doing. So this is something that I see all 3 fins doing, but it is particularly noticeable in the Fantasy 2 and the original Fantasea Fin. Now, this is one of the reasons why I was so, if you've watched my Fantasea Fin review for the original, this is one of the reasons why I was kind of hesitant to get into the Fantasea Fins in the first place. I wasn't sure if I liked the look, and I wasn't quite sure if it would fit my aesthetic. Now, I have gotten used to it over the last couple of years that I've had Fantasea Fins, and now I really, really like it, and I love the way it looks, and I love the way and the movement it adds in the water. However, for all three of these fins, it does change a little bit when you put them inside a tailskin. You see a little bit less of that inward motion. You still see it, but you get a little bit less than you would without a tailskin. I would say that the Fantasea 2 has the most in terms of going inwards, then the Fantasea 1, then the Fantasea 3. The Fantasea 3 is has much more of just a forward backward roll rather than a side to side rolling. So going to some of your questions, Felicia with Fins asks, fold and ease of transport. So what is it like to fold, and how easy is it to transport these three fins? Well, one thing I would say is all three of these fins can be folded. However, the Fantasea 1, the original Fantasea, is the only one I would recommend folding up to put in a soft-sided thing such as a backpack. So what I was recommended when I purchased this fin at the Mertailor booth at Mermagicon was that you fold the fin towards the back. So this is the back of the foot pockets, and that you fold the fin over with the fins over the back. So this is what it looks like. And that you stuff, if you're going to put this in anything, that you put a towel or something in this space to make sure that you don't get any cracking if this was to have pressure applied to it. So with the shape of the Fantasea 1, you can see that the ridges here go in and out, and they're not super thick, and they have a hollow space. They're three-dimensional, so they have a hollow space underneath a concave and a convex. They have a concave space underneath the convex space over top. So one thing that I have found with the Fantasea 2 in terms of storing is that it should never be stored or transported folded as much as possible. This is by far the most fragile of the three fins. You can see here, this was from folding it in a suitcase, and I had it folded over the back and it tore right here. Now, I should be able to fix this with some Silpoxy without too much of a problem. I haven't gotten around to it yet, but I wanted to show you that because these rays here are very thick and very sturdy, and they taper pretty drastically and pretty immediately to these very thin sections along between the rays. And this is that weak point where that rip started. You can kind of see on this one how high that goes, and here is that on this one. And that whole section ripped off and just kept ripping. The Fantasea 3 is much more similar to the Fantasea 1 in that it has more gradual tapering and expanding. So it has a much different wavy texture to the fin, which makes it a lot more durable when you go and fold it. However, in terms of the ease of transport, it is much, much easier to transport the Fantasea fin, the original one, because it is 8 pounds versus the 18 to 20 pounds that the Fantasea 3 is, and the 14 to 16 pounds that the Fantasea 2 is. So definitely the easiest to transport is the Fantasea original. Another question that I get from a lot of people is, what is the difference in propulsion and agility? So the most agile of the three has got to be the Fantasea 1. I covered this a little bit in my review of it, in that because of its size and because of how floppy the ends are, it is very easy to do turns and spins in this monofin compared to the Fantasea 3, just because of the size and how much flowiness and how much resistance you get in the water. I would say next is probably the Fantasea 3, which is a little bit strange, but I think the reason is that the Fantasea 3 is a lot more balanced in terms of the length, and the width. So you get a much different motion, and again, less of that folding in on itself than you do with the Fantasea 2. I would say the Fantasea 2 is the least agile, at least in my experience. In terms of propulsion, however, the Fantasea 2 I think has the best propulsion, and the reason is that it has a bigger area of very thick silicone that is stiffer and so provides, and less drag outside of that stiff area, that provides the best propulsion with the least amount of drag. Once you get to the Fantasea 3, you get almost an equal amount of propulsion, but you get a lot more drag due to the length and weight of the fin. The Fantasea 1 fin, I would say, is about equivalent to a Finis foil. It's not the most powerful, however, you do get almost as much propulsion as you would with a Finis Luna monofin, and I would say the Finis Luna monofin is about comparable to the Fantasea 2 fin. A question from Widget the Mermaid is, how difficult is it to learn how to swim with the floppiness of these fins? That is an excellent question, and it is very different to swimming with a stiff-bladed monofin. I have figured that out, and it is also very different. As I've mentioned kind of the rolling motion, it's also slightly different than learning to swim in the Finis Luna monofin. I would say that this is I would say that any of these are not really beginner-friendly fins, for the reason that they are extremely heavy. Because of the weight, it is easier to stay parallel in the water, especially if you are a more buoyant person. It is more easier to stay parallel in the water, which means that you do get slightly more propulsion in your kick, and you use up less energy trying to keep yourself down. However, these fins, because of the floppiness of them, they are very forgiving, which means that you fall into bad habits quite easily if you have not practiced your mermaid kick. Because of that, you actually don't get the full potential of these fins when you're learning to use them. Another thing is that if you are transitioning from a solid bladed monofin, like the Mermaid Linden monofin, like a Hydra monofin, it is going to be very different, and you have to modify your style of kick when using these very soft silicone monofins. It's going to be a lot bigger kick and a lot slower motion than you would get with kind of the shorter kicks and the more streamlined and technical kicking that you would get with a stiffer monofin blade or a shorter monofin blade. Designs by Adrena asks, what is the weight / drag difference between all of them? Well, as I mentioned before, the weight difference, the Fantasea 1 is approximately 8 pounds, the Fantasea 2 is approximately 14 to 16 pounds, and the Fantasea 3 is 16 to 8, and mine weighs approximately 20 pounds. And as I mentioned before, the propulsion between the three of them is quite different, with the one having the least propulsion and the 2 having the most propulsion of the 3. Nerdmaid Faith asks, which one has the largest pain in the butt factor? The pain in the butt factor is a lot of different things. My Fantasea 2 is a pain in the butt because it's so delicate and it's so heavy. It's very, very hard to travel with it. Versus my Fantasea 3, which I am a little bit more comfortable folding into a suitcase or a monofin bag where I know that it has a little bit more sturdiness in terms of its edges. However, that thing weighs a ton, so I would say the easiest to deal with is definitely the Fantasea Fin Original. The Pearlescent Mermaid asks, is the Fantasea 3 harder on your legs due to its larger size? Yes. The Fantasea Fins, as I said, because they are so heavy, they do require a lot of strength to power. The Fantasea 3 being the heaviest does require the most power. However, I would actually say that in terms of the strain it puts on my back and my legs, the Fantasea 2 is generally the worst for me, just because it is much harder to turn in than the Fantasea 3 or the original Fantasea Fin. The Awesome Mermaid asks, can you do a stacked size comparison for the things? Yes, I will do a stacked size comparison, and I will put them on the screen now so that you can see. You can tell that the Fantasea 3 is huge compared to the Fantasea 2 and the original Fantasea Fin. Crying Lion asks, curious if the foot pocket sizing seems different or consistent between the 3 models. So as far as I know, the foot pockets are the exact same size between all 3 fins. However, you do get a slight difference in how the foot pockets feel due to the size and weight of the monofin. I actually have 2 different sizes. My Fantasea 3 and my original fin are both mediums, and my Fantasea 2 is a large. This was because the large felt very roomy, and because of the weight of the fin and the resistance, I tended to swim out of it, versus the Fantasea 3 where the medium feels a lot more snug, but it also compensates for the resistance of the fin, versus the Fantasea 1 where I feel totally comfortable in the medium, but I could also probably wear a large due to the lack of resistance in that fin. And then the last question, which a lot of you ask, is which one is my favorite? I don't know. There are a lot of different reasons why I like each of these fins, and I would say that out of the 3 of them, my favorite is probably the Fantasea 3, just because I really love how big it is, and I love that proportion. I love that size in proportion to my body and the tails that I make. Now, in terms of functionality and for everyday use, the Fantasea Fin Original is my favorite because it is so easy, but it is also such a comfortable monofin. All 3 of these monofins are so comfortable, but the Fantasea one is definitely my favorite.